Good evening. I'm just going to continue my series on Caruana's amazing achievements at the 2014 Sinquefield Cup, where he won 7 games in a row. So far, he's beaten Veselin Topalov, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Magnus Carlsen, Levon Aronian, and now he comes up against the only player he's not played so far, Hikaru Nakamura. Nakamura has white and Carlsen, and Caruana has black. D4, D5. Very normal. Queen's Gambit. Slav defense. Slav defense modern line. Still in the modern line. They just both developing a piece. Yeah, this is maybe a little bit slower. It's perfectly solid. It's a good move. It's not the most popular, but that's very typical of Nakamura's style, that he plays something very solid, not very typical, that gives him these opportunities later on in the game. So no big surprise. Bishop comes to f5, and the knight attacks the bishop straight away. This is great from Caruana. He plays the bishop to e4, inducing the weakening move f3. Instead of just retreating to g6 immediately, he squeezes a weakening move out of Nakamura as the price for his bishop going to g3. Excellent. Bishop comes to, pawn comes to e6, and it looks a bit like a semi-Slav variation at the moment. Pawn comes to g3, so the bishop can develop to g2. And the bishop comes to g7, he's almost ready to castle. Yeah, this is to stop expansion on the queen side by Caruana. Knight comes to d7, and the pawn's taken, and he takes back with the c pawn. And no, it does look very much like some kind of strange semi-Slav defense. It still says it's the modern Breyer variation, so I'm not going to argue with the machine. So the bishop is now taken and the pawn's taken. The bishop comes to g3, and the pawn comes to g4, e5, sorry, and e4 is a real threat. So both sides castle. Queen comes to b3 to put pressure on this pawn and pressure on this pawn. Queen comes to c8 to defend this pawn. This pawn is already defended by the knight. So the knight comes to back to b8, b1. He's maybe thinking about coming out to c3, bishop here, and a rook onto the c file, something in that nature. Caruana swaps off. They've both got an isolated pawn to deal with. The knight comes to c8, similar idea to what white is planning, and both knights come out to their normal squares, both putting pressure on the pawns. But Caruana's pawn is defended by the knight. Okay, it's attacked by the queen as well, but it's defended by the knight. And if Nakamura goes ahead and takes, Caruana can take this pawn and threaten the queen. So he defends the pawn, and Caruana defends his pawn, at the same time putting his queen on a better square. So 18 moves in. They're both castled. They've both got a pawn in the centre. They've both got their minor pieces developed, and they've both got their queens off the back rank so the rooks can see one another. We can definitely say we're in a middle game. And what do we think? Well, yeah, Nakamura with white has the bishop pair, but his pawn is blocking his bishop on e3, so it's not as effective as it could be. The pawn on d5 doesn't have the same effect on black, because black doesn't have the light squared bishop, so that's a positional compensation. I would guess the evaluation is zeros, but we'll see. 0.2, 0.16, so yeah, I'm right. The advantages and disadvantages weigh up for each other. So, yeah. So the rook comes to the open to the D file. You know, where a lot of the competition is going to take place, and the same happens with white. The rook comes to the open file, and the knight goes back, maybe thinking of coming to c7 to take over the defensive duties from the queen. The bishop retreats to open up the rook's attack on the bishop on e7, and the knight comes as advertised to c7. The bishop retreats, opening up the rook's eyes to the defense of this pawn. Bishop comes to f6, and now he's got 1-2 attackers. Alright, there's 1-2 defenders, so nothing's going to happen to that pawn at the moment. The queen retreats, ready to play b5 and get some queenside expansion in. The pawn comes to g5. Yeah, he might be thinking about playing g4 and attacking the white kingside, trying to break down the pawn structure. The pawn comes to b4 as advertised, and the pawn comes to g6, opens up a square for the bishop or the king. And yeah, it doesn't make the pawns any weaker. You could argue that they're maybe a little bit stronger. The queen centralizes, and the king comes to g7, which isn't just a better square for the king, but it allows the rook access to the h8 square to maybe begin an attack on the h file. The knight is threatened and goes back to e7. The bishop attacks the pawn, and now there's two pieces, the bishop and the queen, attacking this pawn. It's only defended by the bishop. What's the answer? Knight to e6 to defend the pawn again. Also threatens this pawn. Bishop comes to h3, pinning the pawn on e6, thereby pinning one of the defenders of the g5 pawn. Knight comes to f5, threatening to take the bishop and allowing the knight on e6 to move, because it's no longer pinned to the queen. Great move. So he takes, taken back, and now two defenders, two attackers. And this pawn structure, even though black has still got doubled pawns, the double pawns are one line closer to the centre. They're maybe a bit stronger. And the pawn comes to g4. And the pawn comes to, f4. The pawn comes to g4. Goes past. So, yeah, puts a good restraint on the h pawn as well. And, yeah, effectively blockades the situation on the king side whilst Caruana tries to make some progress on the queen side. Queen comes to d3 to attack the pawn on f5. The rook comes to c8, saying if you take my pawn, I'll take your knight, and that's an advantage to me. So the knight is defended by the rook. The pawn comes to c4, saying, yeah, okay, take my pawn, I'll take this pawn with my bishop and win a pawn back, and you know, we'll take it from there, kind of thing. So the knight comes to defend the pawn, which now makes the attack on this pawn more potent, and the pawn comes to c7 so that the queen defends the pawn on f5. And the knight comes back to attack the pawn on d5, but it's defended 1, 2, 3 times, not a problem. The pawn comes to, the rook comes to c8 so that he's threatening to play knight takes pawn, and if knight takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, bishop takes, and then queen takes knight, and yeah, he's gained a pawn. They both got a dark square bishop. Then this pawn falls, but then black gets an attack on the king, so probably worth it. Yeah, he's trying to break down the structure. Obviously wants this pawn to move so that his queen's got access to this square and this square. Well, this square is covered by the pawn and this by the rook, but that's only just at the moment. There will be useful squares. So he takes anyway, and the king comes to challenge the pawn. This allows the knight to take, as we discussed before, on b5. Knight takes back, and the queen takes. Doesn't bother breaking up the structure by taking off the two rooks. He would rather hold a pair of rooks on the board. Queen comes to d7, support the f5 pawn and support the d5 pawn, saying I'm willing to swap off a pair of rooks here, no problem. And he supports the rook with a pawn, saying, yeah, if you want to take my rook, no, it's going to cost you a passed pawn because I'm going to play pawn takes and then I'm going to have a supported passed pawn, whatever you do. The pawn's attacked and defended, and the rook comes back. Maybe a bit of a waste of time. Rook comes to e6, the queen comes to e6. Now, this opens up for possibilities of swapping the queen for two rooks. And bishop to f2 opens up for that possibility. Caruana is willing to swap the queen for two rooks, and now Caruana's got 5 pawns and 2 rooks and a bishop against 4 pawns, a queen and a bishop. Well, we know that 2 rooks is slightly better than a queen, and he's also got an extra pawn. The bishops are of the same colour. This is an advantage to Caruana, absolutely no doubt about it. I'm going to take a guess. Take a guess yourself. Put the video on pause if you need to. But I'm going to guess the advantage to Caruana. We'll read about minus 2.3 here. No, just minus 1. Badly overestimated the advantage there. Live and learn. If you've done better, show off about it in the comments, please. Yeah, okay. Caruana. To move. Oh no, he took the pawn. So, he threatens the pawn. If he gets to take the pawn, then when the pawn takes back, this pawn will be weak, and then this pawn is weak, and this pawn is weak. But it doesn't get much stronger by taking, but he does it anyway. And now he's threatened to play queen takes pawn check, and that can't be stopped. So the king goes to a safer square, and the queen comes here to threaten rook here check. The rook comes to c2, pinning the knight, the bishop, which means that this pawn is only defended by the queen, so that when the queen moves to make this attack, then this pawn might fall. And the queen moves, and the king comes to e8, and the pawn is moved forward, and the pawn is taken. So he's willing to say check here to win his pawn back. And the queen checks, and the king comes here, so that, you know, pawn here isn't as powerful. But the queen takes the pawn, and there's now got a passed pawn. Is white and black in trouble here? Not really. So you can play rook to f2 check. This gives away a pawn, but he's willing to do that. This gives away another pawn, but it gives Caruana a fantastic check. And of course, he can't come to this file, otherwise the rook comes here, and he wins the queen for just one rook, and it's a one position. But now that he has an extra pawn and an extra bishop and the 2 rooks, it's a great position for Caruana. So king comes to g4, king comes to c7. Oh, sorry, pressed the wrong button there. I'll just have to get to a position where we're at. Good to run quickly through it again anyway. It's not just amateurism from me. Well, it is just amateurism from me, but I'll make it sound good. Try to. So he's played bishop to d4 to threaten the bishop. Bishop's now pinned. So he's going to win a bishop here. But of course, the queen gets a check first. King comes to d8, not immediately to f7 because then the queen takes pawn with check. So the queen takes the pawn, but it's without check. The rook is able to take the pawn with check, and the king is checked again. And oh, it was here we'd come to before. Yeah, he plays f2 check, and the king has to go back to g4, and the king comes to c7. He's looking to maybe run here, maybe come here, maybe win this pawn, and maybe hide somewhere here, or possibly here where he can hide from all the checks. But the rook comes back, blocks the check. The rook is pinned, but it doesn't matter. The bishop now importantly covers the f8 square where the pawn would queen. So, and the two rooks are also covering the f7 square. This pawn's not queening. If Caruana can get out of all the checks, he will get a win here. So, yeah, he takes another pawn. So you got two passed pawns. And now he's really compact position. No real way to break up into that position. The king moves and the rook comes out so that he's threatening rook here, pinning the queen to the king. And even if he ends up losing both rooks, it doesn't matter as long as he gets the pawn. He can actually afford to sacrifice both rooks and the bishop for that pawn and that queen, and then he's going to win with these other two pawns. So the king comes forward and the pawn goes to b4. He can just wander up and get his own queen. Queen comes to e6 and the bishop comes to d4, threatening the pawn, and if the pawn moves, the rook comes here anyway. And he's also threatening to play, if the pawn moves, just to take it with the rook. And if he takes with the queen, well, he takes with the rook, and then he takes with the king, but one of these pawns queens. And Hikaru resigned here, not before time. Yeah, his pawn is stopped, and it's really difficult to prevent this pawn from being taken. He can't move it to take. He would have to move his king, but then the pawn's going to get taken with a check, or the rook will take it with a check. So, rook or bishop will take it with a check, unless he comes here, in which case the bishop just takes it, and really, Nakamura hasn't got any good follow-up checks, and his position will collapse. So that was 5 wins in a row to Caruana. Again, can't say enough what a fantastically good performance this was in this tournament by Fabiano Caruana. Yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share my videos. Thanks. Bye.